So I want to share an anecdote without sharing a name. I was at a conference and I was talking to someone I've known for a while who's the assistant head at one of our, I think you would consider it to one of our flagship schools in Atlanta. And I said, all right, hypothetical kid. What if I had a kid that was easily, like I described before, college level intellect, but say second or third grade reading ability, extremely dyslexic. And let's say that independently, they could take anything that was given to them, scan it independently, no pressure on the teacher to do it or to come up with it, and they took care of that and the computer read to them, and they got all of it and could engage in discussions. And what if everything they wrote, they did with this speech to text, and they turned in beautifully organized, beautifully reasoned papers that were, say, at the top of your class? Would you take that student? And his answer was this, which I think is really one of the things that got me thinking about this presentation. He said, we probably should, and we probably wouldn't. And I, of course, said, well, why? And he said, I think I have too many teachers that could never get past reading and writing in text as the way in and out for learning. And with our technological landscape, that is simply not true anymore. And I'm going to put up some logos of some schools. The great irony is that these schools would snap that kid up in a heartbeat. There may be some view that there's some magical LD pedagogy that we do with the kids. In fact, most of what LD schools do is solid research-based pedagogy. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. To unpack the title, Neuroscience, Learning Differences in the Students You May Be Missing Out On, I want to talk about an emerging view of learning disabilities or learning differences that are less about a pathology or something wrong with a kid and more about the interaction with their environment that we have more control over as schools. And in terms of the neuroscience, I am going to look a little bit deeply at what goes on in the brain with reading, because I think that dyslexia as a category is one that we're all very familiar with, and one that I actually think that schools could address more broadly at the older ages. I'm also going to look at some of the brain science around, or some suggestions from the research about how we should be structuring schools that I think benefit all kids. So with that in mind, I am going to start with two overarching concepts that I'd like to sort of have in the air as we talk. And the first one is a view of learning differences as a student-environment relationship issue, that when kids struggle, I'd like to see schools move from a view that there's something intrinsically wrong with a kid and more a view of what we can do as a school to make that relationship a more productive one. And to start with that, I'm going to look at some of the history of learning disabilities since the 20s. I'm leaning on a book called The Handbook of Learning Disabilities by Hallahan and Mock that came out in 2003. The first period they talk about is the foundation period, which coincides with compulsory schooling. And lo and behold, once we said that all kids had to go to schools of a certain structure, we actually created the need for remediation. And in the process, unraveled an amazing network of apprenticeships and experiential learning that kids now didn't have access to. This was also the period where some of the pioneers in learning disabilities, Samuel Orton, Anna Gillingham, Norman Geschwind, did their work because all of a sudden these kids couldn't meet the structure that was handed to them, and we had to do something different. But at this time, the schools were not expected to do anything. And interestingly, this is also the period when John Dewey was pounding the pulpit saying, students should not be made to go through this structure that requires an exact rote set of information to master, but schools should be structured to meet the needs of the students and make them the best students that they can across a broad range of experience. Towards the end of this period, we entered a stretch that led to the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which we know more commonly as IDEA. And culminating in 1975, this legislation could not be, the importance could not be overstated. This was the first time they said that schools need to address the needs of this population within the schools in what I think everyone has heard of as the least restrictive environment. The period following that, the authors talk about a solidification period where all schools came to grips with the fact that we need to be addressing this within the schools. Now, this was incredibly powerful because for the first time we viewed learning disabilities in the same way we viewed accessibility issues, vision, speech and hearing, mobility. it had the unintended consequence of viewing learning disabilities as a pathology or almost a disease model with a diagnosis and a cure. And in order to receive services, you had to have a discrepancy between what was viewed as your overall intelligence and your performance in some area. We know enough about intelligence to know that this unified view of intelligence doesn't fit human cognition. But the benefit was that many kids began to get services. But following that, with I think some of the questions that we had about are we really meeting the needs of the students as well as we could, we entered what the authors call the turbulent period, which I think we're well in today. The authors stop at 2001 because their book came out in 2003, but I think we're still debating the best way to work with these kids. And in this period, specifically notable events, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, which set requirements for employers to address learning issues as well as mobility issues and how they hired and made reasonable accommodations. In 1975, as I said, that was the IDEA was re-upped, I guess you could say, and they added the piece that kids could not be deprived the general and regular curriculum. That was a big shift as well, because these kids were being taken out of regular curriculum and worked with on their struggles, but not in the broader learning. And then in 2004, the reauthorization of IDEA included the requirement that you could not use the discrepancy model as your only way of deciding whether kids get services. So the fact is what we know is that there are kids who meet the diagnostic criteria for learning disabilities who actually do okay in school. And there are kids who don't meet the criteria who do terribly in school. And so now what we're working with is the response to intervention model, which just says if a kid is struggling, you need to address that and provide support and services. And I think we're a long way away from really establishing that in our schools, but I think we're moving in the right direction conceptually. A second major concept I want to have in our thinking is cerebrodiversity. And that is the notion that the human mind comes in a distribution, and that some of the things that we have actually been pathologizing are actually part of the normal distribution of human cognitive development. This is certainly reflected in the ideas of Howard Gardner that intelligence is a multifaceted idea. David Perkins, also at Harvard, does some great work with the different natures of intelligence and what we have incredible control over. And certainly the brain science of plasticity says we have much more authorship over our intellectual abilities than we've previously thought. So to flesh that out, I made up a few kids. And so if you look at this chart, and if you sort of imagine that this is these are the highest performing kids in your environment, and these are the kids in your environment that are really, really struggling, and perhaps ones that you were saying, you know, maybe they're not a good match for our school. Student number one, let's call this a solid A, maybe a few B's student, but really hardworking. So if you look at these, we have verbal and spatial, which I think are the actual, like, sort of ingrained cognitive abilities. Literacy and math have much more to do with school performance and whether you can fully express those verbal and spatial abilities. Social, collaborative skills, executive function, and persistence. There's certainly many more aspects that we look for in kids, but I want to use these. So to describe this student, fairly even across the board, and of course, school might be the only place in our culture where all people are expected to be equally good at everything that they do. We scatter as we get into the professional world according to our strengths, but schools really do not allow a lot of variation in terms of weaknesses and strengths, especially for the weaknesses. Because if you look at student number two, this made-up kid has extraordinarily high verbal skills, can understand language and express incredibly detailed, sophisticated ideas, very good with physical, three-dimensional space, building, the kind of skills you would want in an engineer or an architect, but very low literacy skills. Consequently, access to math performance through the filter of reading and writing is low. So these would be, I would say, pretty low grades and may put the student at risk of not passing in your school environment. But great socially, great at persistence, and I missed the label here, but let's say they're a little scattered and executive function is a little off. What the long-term studies of adult efficacy and success would suggest is that this kid is going to do quite well out in the world as an adult, but may actually fail out of your schools on the path to do that. And then just to really drive that point home, Let's talk about this student that in the school performance arena actually is performing lower in your environment, but is incredibly social, collaborative, persistent, and great organizational skills. There are a couple of longitudinal studies that looked at LD kids from school into 10 and 20-year marks out into adulthood, and they looked for attributes of success, and they were looking at job success and happiness, job stability, family relationships and stability, overall measures of happiness. And what they found is the things in school that correlated with that were persistence, teamwork, collaboration, executive function skills, and in fact, things that did not track with adult success were grades, standardized testing scores. In fact, grades and standardized testing scores only correlate with one thing, and that is success in subsequent schooling, but they don't track very well with life success. And this is, I thought, as an LD school, most interesting. The successful remediation of the learning disability did not track with adult success in those measures. So that's interesting to consider. There were kids that didn't have their reading and writing or language sort of fixed, quote unquote, as well, but if they had these other attributes, they were successful adults. And so I want to ask the question, what does it mean for a kid to have a profile that is incredibly successful in the world that we inhabit, but unsuccessful in our school structure? And I think that raises some questions. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the brain architecture of dyslexic kids. And as Damien said, this slide is gross, but this is an ectopia. And what you're looking at here, this is about the outer 2 or 3 millimeters of your brain. It's a cross-section of your cortex. In many dyslexic brains, and if you're dyslexic, you can't find this out because you have to chop your head open and cross-section your brain, which is generally not asked for. They have these structures called ectopias, which are this sort of eruption of neurons into an area that typically doesn't have dendritic connections that perforates the cortex. They don't know exactly why they're formed or what they're for, but interestingly, ectopias do correlate with skills in spatial analysis, mechanical and digital aptitude, creative problem solving, connecting disparate pieces of a puzzle, visualization skills, artistic expression, and athletics. So I'm going to give another stat that I think is kind of striking, I think it's related to this, is if you look at the rate of dyslexia in the United States, and there's not agreement on this, but I've done enough poking around to feel comfortable that this is an accepted range of the rate of dyslexia in America. That is the rate of dyslexia among CEOs. So it's nearly double the national average. So I'm going to show you some, I think we would not argue, some very successful people who had a miserable time in school, almost all of them because of struggles with pushing and receiving text. Charles Schwab, the financial leader, Orlando Bloom, Craig McCaw, who was one of the pioneers of the cellular industry, Anderson Cooper, Tom Cruise, Jay Leno, Richard Branson of Virgin, Steve Jobs, some people have heard of him, Paul Orfalea founded Kinko's, Whoopi Goldberg, Walt Disney. The guy on the right is Bill Hewlett. That's Dave Packard. This is Hewlett-Packard. Alexander Graham Bell. And so, as a gallery, you have to ask yourself, do you want these people in your school community? Do you want your other students interacting with these minds? And most of these did make it through school, but they described school as something to have to get through to get at the real work. So again, learning disability is a very broad concept, and I'd like to talk specifically about dyslexia. And I'm going to put up what might be a controversial slide, which is taking reading down a peg. So if you view the purpose of reading or the purpose of literacy is to receive and transmit knowledge and information. And historically, it was the only way to get information without being personally present at the source. It was the only way to communicate something if you wanted it to outlive the ethereal voice waves in the air that go away immediately. In this day and age, we have amazing access to information. We have computers that can read and write for us. We have Skype where we can talk to professionals elsewhere. So it's not the only game in town anymore. It is very, very important, but it is not the only game. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the neurology of reading. And if you look at this timeline, and I'll orient you, it's about 600 milliseconds, or a little over half a second, from the viewing of the word to the ability of the brain to start comprehending, sort of getting the semantic content of it. So initially, the visual cortex sees the word as it sees anything. It does a little visual feature analysis here. We have a specific area that processes visual word forms that it gets passed to. Executive and attentional processes get brought to bear to manage the sequencing of reading and remembering what we last read and managing all of that. It gets passed along to semantic and phonological processes like this sound matches this word, which matches this concept. All of it is extraordinarily complicated, and I think it's important to know that our brain is not designed to read. It has actual modules that deal with language. It has modules that deal with movement, but it is made up reading with a bunch of different parts of the brain meant to do other things, and it's actually very susceptible to degradation or to not function well. But it's not till we get here that we see the semantic and comprehension able to take place. So you can have a very bright thinker, but something going on here, and they will not look like a very bright thinker. So I'm assuming most people in the room are expert readers, and most of you online, and we wouldn't be drawn into education if we weren't already kind of good at the game of education in schools. But if you are a good reader, these few areas in your left hemisphere are active in the decoding process, and it leaves the rest of the brain free to think with. If you look at the brain scan of an earlier emerging reader, what you'll see is both sides of the brain active, a much more diffuse network trying to pull off this very complicated task. As an emerging reader becomes a better reader, the process does what they say is left lateralizes and frees the brain up. But to go back to the comprehension slide, if you look at the areas required for comprehension and look at the areas required to struggle with reading, there's a literal physical bandwidth issue that if we're struggling with the text, our brain isn't thinking thoughts about the text at a very deep level. And in fact, there are kids who look and sound completely remediated in the reading that are still using these diffuse networks. So you might have a fourth grader pick up a page and sound great, but they're using these networks, and then you make this inaccurate assumption, well, their comprehension isn't very high. But if you can get the reading out of the way, you may find otherwise. And so I need 4 volunteers out of a very small group who's not slipping and sliding on the ice when they go home. Come on up. And if there's any thought about I don't want to be exposed, I kind of say, tough. We do this to kids every day in every class. So, thank you all. And what I'm going to ask you to do in a sequence, let's say starting with Pat, they're going to tell a story. I'm going to give you a topic, a dog at the beach. You're going to make it up as you go along, but you're not allowed to say a word that has the letter N in it. Go.
Chased a bird.
Dog ran back to the beach.
Ran.
Oh, any letter N.
That wasn't a good pedagogical choice for me as a teacher. So I think that is, that's all I needed from you. Please have a seat and thank you. But my point with this is what that task did is added another layer of language processing on top of the thought process, which is what reading does to the thought process. And here's what I would want you to contemplate. And those of you watching this online who are thankful that you didn't have to do that, if you just judge this group on the quality of that story, on the complexity of the sentences, on the vocabulary choices, on the coherence of the story, you would make assumptions about their abilities, about their thinking abilities, if you didn't look under the covers of the processing layer on top of cognition. So imagine then, too, knowing the cognitive level of the 4, and I think it's high, what would it be like to be sitting on that intellectual promise and to be continually judged by this processing layer? And also, what would it be like for us to be missing out on the actual abilities of thought there, given a different set of structures or a different amount of time? So thank you for that. And that leads me to start a discussion about what might schools look like that would allow a broadening of cerebrodiversity. I want to be clear, this is not about every school being an LD school, but whatever your population is, I think there are things that schools could do that would just expand the range of students that you could serve or not have to refer out. And I think that not just at a benefit to the kid, but a great benefit to you as a school. So I'm going to put up 2 quotes. You know, for those of us that have gotten into education, this is not very complimentary of our chosen field. And I want to share a story. I went to Emory, and when I was there, the Woodruff Foundation, Robert Woodruff, gave a massive, I think it was like a $225 million donation to the school, one of the largest gifts in, I think, the history of universities. And there was a conversation between him and the president, Jim Laney, on stage in front of a bunch of people. Now, Robert Woodruff went to Emory, but he got, disinvited after, I think, about a year and a half or 2 years. And so President Laney asked him this question: imagine what you could have accomplished if you had finished Emory. And without missing a beat, Woodruff said, yeah, it would have been 2 years behind. And that's an amazing statement. And so then it raises the question for me, what might Emory have been at the time to make it worth the while of somebody with that degree of promise, talent, sort of the movers and shakers, to move their cognitive ball forward in schools? So fortunately, I think there's some good answers that serve all kids. And I'm going to start with a really depressing percentage. There was a study done of kids in terms of the retention of content that they got in school. And they took kids who had done well in the units, done well on the test, and they simply tested them on the same content at the 30-day mark, out from that. This was how much was retained from their classroom content experience. And so if you can assume that there's a 90% sort of mental attrition of what you're doing in terms of a content-oriented class, well then I wonder, what might we do with that same amount of time that's going to stick around in terms of the kids' skill set and how they meet the world? There are 2 broad areas that are just the education world is abuzz with. The first one is 21st century learning. And I think part of the answer is in this arena. And I think we all know there are lots of different configurations of 21st century learning. I'm going to lean on Pat Bassett's, which are the 5 C's plus 1. And you look at attributes like communication, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, cross-cultural competency, that's hard to say, and character. And I think about some of my high school kids at the Howard School that would probably really struggle with a lecture-based class with the pace, the note-taking requirements, the volume, the memory load, the writing load, and I think that model would not work for them. But our kids can do these things. And in fact, what we're hearing is that these are the skills that people need to meet the challenges of the world. The next big area is we hear about design thinking. And in fact, the next Lunch and Learn, which is going to be done by Bo Adams, is going to deal with this topic. It's not the title, but I would encourage you to sign on for that. And the last Lunch and Learn, which was Grant Lichtman, which was implementing innovation, he went around to schools that were doing innovative things. And what he saw in successful kids was also this list of things. So if you look at design thinking, that's about solving problems with real-world solutions. And you have to know the context of the problem and empathize with it, define specifically what the problem is, creative ideation about what you might do about it. And this is, I think, the important part, building physical prototypes with your hands, testing and revising and messing around and checking, really what inventors do, and then revising and testing that at the end as one of the critical skills that kids need moving forward. And again, in both of these areas, these reach a broader range of kids than the lecture-based, content-driven classroom, and I think arguably would be a better intellectual model for all kids, including the most talented. So those are sort of the broad movements in schools, and I'd like to support that by talking a little bit about the brain with regard to exercise and movement. Now this is, I think we all grew up with the notion that we were born with a brain, it had a certain number of neurons, and that's what we got. And of course we killed a number of them off in college, and then we had the next set, and that was it. Well, within the last 15 or 20 years, what we've learned is that the brain does indeed grow new neurons. Within the last 10 years, more excitingly, it seems that they are the stem cells, the progenitors of the neurons, are actually migrating to the hippocampus, which is the major player in laying down long-term memories. In fact, if you're missing your hippocampus, which some lesion patients have had happen, you can literally not make any new memories at all. You retain your old memories, but you can't make new ones. So the hippocampus, I'm going to come back to it in a diagram, but that is a critical part of memory. And then, in the last 5 years, they realized that it's the new cells that are going to the head of the class and being used by the brain. So us with the 40, 50, 60-year-old brains, physical exercise are giving us new neurons, fresh new ones that help with our learning. So how do you grow new neurons? The single most powerful way is exercise. If you've read the book Spark by John Rady out of Harvard, he has way more data about this than you would, it's a great book, I suggest you read it, but there's so much research backing this notion. But what happens when you raise your heart rate up and you're physically fit is your brain puts out this substance called, for short, BDNF, but brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which stimulates neurogenesis in the brain. And it is done through being physically fit. I think we've all heard that from an evolutionary perspective, we are meant to be savanna people, like running after animals and having these intense nomadic days, walking as much as 12 miles a day as part of our normal living. I'm not sure how many of you move that much in the course of a day, but I would bet it would be not many. So I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of this beyond growing your neurons. Cardiovascular exercise leads to a 60% drop in Alzheimer rates in later age, a 50% drop in dementia. This is roughly lower school, middle school, high school, and let me explain the chart. The little blue bar is reading performance, the purple bar is math performance, and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are the number of fitness standards that their students reached. They didn't do the exercise to cause the learning, but the correlation is the more fitness standards you're able to reach, the better your academic performance in reading and mathematics across their population. A bigger difference here in the mathematical performance, but basically, the more physically fit you are, the better your brain works. In fact, Rady, there are a couple of schools that really took this and fully implemented. There's a school in, I'm going to forget the name, but it's near Chicago, where they've gone as far as to put treadmills in the math classrooms, and the first thing that kids do in the morning is they go into math and they get their heart rates up. They're seeing, they have like a 3% obesity rate in the school, which if you know, the national average is 30%. They have absenteeism has gone down, emotional issues have gone down, grades have gone up. And they chose to take, there's an international test on science and math called the TIMSS. You can actually sign up as a school as if you're a country, and they did that. They were, the year they did that, they were the #1 country in the world in science and the #6 country in the world in mathematics. They were not that years before they had started this. So there's that is a correlation, not a cause, but it's a pretty compelling one. So that's on the learning side. Let's talk about our mental health. When Prozac was introduced, it was like any drug preceded by many, many, many studies. The New England Journal of Medicine did a meta-analysis of all of the studies. And so out of all the studies that were completed, and this I think wouldn't surprise us, only 51% of them were released. The other 49% did not show effectiveness. They were either equivocal or they showed it as not effective. And when they evaluated all of the data, SSRI, that is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that's the category of Prozac. Prozac was 49% effective. Placebo was 30% effective. This is for mild to moderate depression. Exercise was 45% effective as a treatment. So that's interesting. A later study, and more recent in the last 8 years or so, they looked at the same thing with Zoloft, and the control groups were medication only, exercise only, combination. This is a measure of the depression levels, mild to moderate, prior to treatment. The exercise treatment group was statistically indistinguishable from the medication group. That is just as effective as being medicated for the depression. So that's also, I think, fairly compelling about our body's ability to regulate itself. We're not living lifestyles, I think, that let the body regulate itself the way it could possibly. And this is not to say that medication isn't appropriate. It is, but there are other things that also impact these mental profiles. This, I love this list of things. This is a collection of odd little studies. We know that our brain makes our body do things, but you need to know that your body makes your brain do things. And if you use your body in certain ways, it will alter your mood level, your activity level, your thought processes. So let's just run through these. There was a study that showed that people that were holding a warm cup of coffee acted more warmly towards others. That if you strike a power pose, you will indeed make bolder decisions than you would if you're not doing that. We equate dirtiness with immorality. I have a very, very immoral car, you should know. If you are thirsty, you'll estimate the distance between you and a bottle of water as being closer than if you're not thirsty. If you're carrying a backpack, you'll estimate the steepness of a hill as more steep than if you're not wearing the backpack. If you're moving a physical object upwards in space, it will speed the recall of positive events. If you're sitting on a hard chair, you'll make tougher negotiations. If you force a smiling expression, it will make you report cartoons as being funnier. There was another study that's not in here, but they did a bunch of questionnaires of people to gauge their level of happiness, and they made the test group hold a pencil like this in their teeth. So what does that make your mouth do? Sort of forces you to smile. So they weren't even saying smile. They were saying hold a pencil in their teeth. And they reported themselves as happier than people that were not doing that. So the musculature of the smiling mechanism had an impact on their self-assessment. That's kind of neat. I like this one too. If you're thinking about the past or the future, it makes people sway forward or backwards ever so slightly. So we are meant to reference our thoughts in terms of physical space. This guy, Rodolfo Linas, he wrote a great book called Eye of the Vortex. He's trying to answer the question, how do we get consciousness out of a bunch of metabolic processes? And in neuroscience, they call that the problem of consciousness, because they can't really figure out how do we have this sort of experience out of a bunch of electrochemical interactions. But I love this quote, that which we call thinking is the evolutionary internalization of movement, that we reference our entire cognitive infrastructure on a substrate of motricity or physical interactions. That doesn't mean you can't lose motor abilities and think, but if you take an infant and there are no motor abilities there, they won't develop thought processes. So there is something really connected there. But I think a little more fun, and I'm leading to the next slide after this is the fun one. This is the part of the brain, the sensory cortex, called the homunculus. And if you look at sort of a stripe on your own head going down here on both sides, there's a map of your body on that stripe of sensory cortex. And it's roughly similar in every brain, and it's the amount of real estate the brain devotes to senses from certain parts of the body. Well, this artist did this sort of sculpture model about what our bodies would look like if we were proportioned in the same way that our homunculus is proportioned, and that's what they came up with. So I think this is such a vivid picture of what our brain likes to do. We are a hands-on, touching, feeling organism. Look at the mouth, like communication, social connection, talking. So these are the things that our brain really wants to do. And I'm going to use this as a jumping board into what Eric Jansen talks about as the enriched school environment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the features of an enriched environment are according to him. First, it's one that allows movement. Voluntary, gross motor movement, hand movement. Now reference that against how many of your classes have kids still sitting, even if they're in nice little table configurations, still for long stretches of time. It needs to be novel, challenging, and this is important, meaningful. That is, the kid has to be personally engaged in what the content is. Coherent complexity, I love that term. Ambiguity, lack of clarity of outcomes, the ability to think through all the various possibilities and not be satisfied that there's one right answer, that's a piece of the enriched environment. Manage stress. Challenge, like not quite sure if we can meet the challenge here, but I think we can. That's sort of Vygotsky zone of proximal development, if you're familiar with his work. Social support and social connections are a critical piece. And also sufficient time. That is the ability to get into a project and go all the way through the thought work, building work, completion of it, our compartmentalized, siloed view of schedules don't allow for that. The good news for all of you lower school teachers is that all of these things are built into the lower school process. It turns out we all like that. And it turns out that even in adult learning, if you look at some of the cutting edge, like corporate education, they involve things like Legos and drawing and getting three-dimensional manipulations going to help with our thought. A little bit about multisensory learning. There are many, many studies about that. They always lead to better recall in the studies, as much as 50 to 75%. So take a kid that can really handle the lecture-based classroom, they still recall better with a multisensory experience. So I would say it this way, like my kids at the Howard School can't tolerate non-ideal pedagogy. There are many kids who can. It's still not the best model for them. The neurological effects of these environments, and they've sliced mice open, not kids, but they see larger neurons, they see more branching, faster signaling, a thicker cortex, increased memory, increased neurogenesis, that is the creation of new neurons, and inoculation from stress. So I think all of us out there and in here would say these are the kinds of environments we'd personally like to be sitting through, and I think the question is how do we get our schools to be doing this on a broader scale, knowing that there are many, many schools doing this stuff amazingly well. So the brain architecture of, I think, what I've just laid out, you hear about this term, the effort-driven reward system, and that there are three major areas that have to do with satisfying work. One of them is the nucleus accumbens, which is, some people call it the pleasure button. But this is active in pleasure and reward. It's connected to the dopamine pathways, which is the sort of the little pleasure squirt of neurotransmitter we get when we're excited about things or anticipating things. The striatum has strong pathways to the motor cortex, and so this system is active when we're moving. And in fact, this is more active when we're moving. And the third major area is the amygdala, which deals with the processing of emotions. So the three of these together are active in a number of things. Interestingly, it's active when we're in the act of saliency determination, that is, what's important about this thing. There's a little bit of mind sleuthing going on. And when we figure it out, we get this like, aha, this is the source of intrinsic motivation. When we're just happy that we did it because we did it, this is what's active. But here's what I think is amazing. I talked about the hippocampus. It's right here. You know, I think we say all the time that emotions are important in the learning process. The amygdala is actually affixed to the end of the hippocampus. Like architecturally, the brain wants to attach emotions to laying down memory and learning. But if you look at the proximity to all of these structures to the hippocampus, you start to get a sense that the brain is itself wired to learn best with these kinds of approaches and methods. So then, what does that mean for our subjects? I think I often hear, well, the subject I'm teaching doesn't lend itself that easily to these kinds of methods. So the big oval here, if we say that that is everything that's important about a topic, then I think we can agree that in any K-12 classroom, we are not going to cover everything important about any topic. There are people that weave entire doctoral programs about some narrow little subslice of a politician's career. If we are indeed, from the get-go, making sub-choices, then let's look at what of the sub-choices are more likely to be personally relevant to the kids in the class. Which ones lend themselves more to hands-on multisensory learning? Which ones are open-ended enough to allow for critical thinking and problem solving? And then you start feeling like there might be a sweet spot of our choices that would at least up the odds of us being able to change some of the methodology in the classroom from a content delivery model to a thought-based model and an action and engaged kind of model. And I had a thought and it escaped me. So I want to press pause on the idea of the school environment, and I do want to circle back to one, I think, really important topic, which is what about the reading and writing? And having had a slide that said taking reading down a peg, we, of course, at the Howard School teach reading and writing all the way through the high school. We have literacy specialists working on it. but we make choices about, in a given moment, is our goal to teach thinking about history, or is it to practice reading? So if you have a kid that has high school, college level intellect and second, third grade reading abilities, if you force them through the lens of third, fourth reading content, I think there's some ethical considerations about doing a disservice to the child's intellect. And in the lower school, of course, we are still like heavy on the pursuit of teaching reading to all the kids. So this is not about bypassing that process, but it is about sorting out reading, which is not an intellectual process. It's a mechanical, neurological process. It is unrelated to the broader idea of intelligence. So I wanted to do a little bit of a push about assistive technology, because I often say this is a great time to grow up with learning differences, because there are compensatory tools in the computer realm that help these kids. One broad category is speech to text. The computers can hear what you're saying. They type it out beautifully. Most of you have probably heard of Dragon Naturally Speaking. And in fact, you will find, like, what do doctors use when they take notes in the hospital? This technology. Lawyers that have to write all day? This technology. Professional writers. So this is not even about a disability. This is about, they're incredibly efficient at this point. And I want to say, if you've ever played around with this technology and gone, it misses all the words I'm saying. If you haven't looked at it in the last year even, it's a different level of accuracy, so I would encourage you to take another look at that. And anything that exists in text can be scanned and recognized and put on the computer, which can also read to the student. And we have lots of kids at the Howard School that, when we're dealing with content, do this. Here's what's amazing is that the emerging research about the computer reading and the words being highlighted, it actually increases independent reading ability over time. It sounds like a bypass, but even that does help us. It helps the kid read better independently. So I want to share an anecdote without sharing a name. I was at a conference, and I was talking to someone I've known for a while who's the assistant head at one of our, I think you would consider it to one of our flagship schools in Atlanta. And I said, all right, hypothetical kid. What if I had a kid that was easily, like I described before, college level intellect, but say second or third grade reading ability, extremely dyslexic. And let's say that independently, they could take anything that was given to them, scan it independently, no pressure on the teacher to do it or to come up with it, and they took care of that and the computer read to them, and they got all of it and could engage in discussions. And what if everything they wrote, they did with this speech to text, and they turned in beautifully organized, beautifully reasoned papers that were, say, at the top of your class? Would you take that student? And his answer was this, which I think is really one of the things that got me thinking about this presentation. He said, we probably should, and we probably wouldn't. And I, of course, said, well, why? And he said, I think I have too many teachers that could never get past reading and writing in text as the way in and out for learning. And with our technological landscape, that is simply not true anymore. And I'm going to put up some logos of some schools. The great irony is that these schools would snap that kid up in a heartbeat. If you go to the Harvard Office of Learning Disabilities, you can get a reader assigned to you, a note taker assigned to you. The assistive technology, you can use it all the way through, because they understand that these kids that I showed you pictures of that have grown into these amazingly powerful adults in our communities have not done well in our schools, and they want those minds in their communities. So I think that would be the end of, I'd like to give some food for thought, and I think with that as a stopping place, I would love to open the door to questions.